Vocal compression, one of the most widely discussed and debated topics in music production, but nobody ever seems to explain why. So let's take a quick detour and figure it out.
Side roads.
So why vocal compression, and why does that even matter in the first place? Well, if you're like me and prefer to learn things holistically, I'm going to explain this to you today, because once I was able to finally grasp this concept, things really opened up and started to change for me. Okay, so this video is not a deep dive into what compression is, but as I realize some of you may not know, the absolute shortest version is that compression is a way of taking an extremely dynamic audio source, dynamic meaning that there is a really big difference between the loudest parts and the quietest parts, and changing them or compressing them into a much less dynamic audio signal, meaning that there is a lot smaller difference between the loudest and quietest parts. And there are endless ways to achieve this and countless topologies and hardware and software compressors, but the basic goal is to take a very dynamic audio source and change it into something that is much less dynamic and much more consistent and uniform and level. Which leads us back to the original question, why? Well, luckily for you, I'm a visual learner and my daughter loves Legos, so here we go. So these different colored waveforms very loosely represent what some elements of a song might be. The red could be a kick drum, the orange a snare, the yellow a lead guitar, the brown a bass, the blue could be a piano, and the gray in the back could be some big synth pad. These are very loosely arranged by what their frequencies might be, but that doesn't matter. For this example, we're only worried about level, the highest peak of each waveform being the loudest for each element. Now enter our very dynamic vocal. You'll see right away that the loudest parts of the vocal are louder still than the kick drum or the snare, while that center small waveform is way quieter than the kick and the snare. It's quieter even than the guitar and the bass parts. Well, why does this matter? Well, it matters because of the way we as humans perceive louder levels to be closer and quieter levels to be further away. And we can begin to visualize this if we flip our little plot on its side and get our listener in there. And you can start to see how the tops of the louder waveforms are much closer to the listener, while the quieter parts are further away. And here's a real-world example of how that sounds.
Hello. Hello. Hello.
Which makes perfect sense, right? If I'm right up next to you talking, it's going to be much louder than if I'm further away. But one of the most important things to understand is all of these elements and the way we perceive them are in relationship with one another, which is why I left the ambient noise on in this clip. You'll notice not only do I sound quieter as I get further away, but the ambient noise sounds louder, even though nothing has changed. It's because our brain perceives things in relationship to one another. So if our very dynamic vocal has levels that are louder than the loudest other parts, and still has levels that are quieter than some of the quiet parts, it's going to create this psychoacoustic effect of coming in and out on the listener, getting very close and then diving behind everything far away. And that's not what you're trying to accomplish. And if we move the fader up to make those quieter parts more audible, you can see that the louder parts are now way louder than everything else. And when those come in relationship, everything else will get buried underneath them. And conversely, if you bring the louder levels way down to make them better, now the quietest parts are way underneath everything and you're not going to be able to hear any of them. Finally, enter the very compressed vocal. And now you can see right away that the quieter parts of our vocal are no longer buried down below even some of the quieter elements in our song. And the louder parts of the vocal are no longer way louder than the louder parts of our song. Well, what does that mean? And here's where we finally get to our answer. It means now when you slide the volume fader for your vocal up, it means that your vocal is moving up cohesively, and now you can finally and accurately get it to sit where you want it to sit within your song. And there's no right or wrong answer to this, except that you generally don't want them sitting too low where you can't hear them. And this is also where a lot of those terms come from that I didn't understand at the beginning. Like, for example, in general, pop and some hip hop and country will sit up higher and sit on top of the mix. And that's what producers and engineers mean when they say, I want the vocal to be sitting on top a little more. For rock and indie and some other genres, generally, you might want that vocal to be down a little bit further to let some of the other instruments breathe a little bit more. But in either case, now you actually have the real ability to get your vocal to sit in the sweet spot or sit in the pocket that you want to sit it at. And there is no way to accomplish that if the dynamic of your vocal is both louder and quieter than other parts. And one other important thing to remember is now that you have this compressed vocal, you can and should slide it up and down to move and breathe throughout your song. Typically and generally, bumping it up a half or a dB into the choruses, or maybe sliding it back down a dB right before a big drop to another part. These are all things you can only accomplish with a nice, even, and leveled vocal. So now you know the why of vocal compression, so get out there and take that first step.